the first question that we're going to do for Data Amnesty today is, what is an RCT? So first of all, an RCT is a randomized control trial. And essentially, a randomized control trial is a very specific way to determine causality, to determine if one thing causes an effect on another thing. So for example, does this particular type of medication cure COVID-19? Or does the project that I'm working on help reduce the number of low birth weight babies that are born? Or does this policy that we just put in practice help increase the household incomes in our community? It's used a lot in the development of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. It's also used a lot in agriculture. So what kind of fertilizer? Does this fertilizer increase the harvest of my wheat? And most recently, it's been applied to social situations, so situations with people. And these are very different situations. So let's figure out why you would ever bother to run something called a randomized control trial. So here's our group of people that are our community. And we are going to offer some kind of a program or project or treatment to these people. So we're going to do something that we want to have an effect on these people, whether it's to give them a vaccine so they don't get a disease, or whether it's to give them a special kind of training so it makes it easier for them to get jobs. So let's say we're going to do that one. We're going to give a special kind of training to make it easier for people to find work. We need to know, does our training work or does it not work? The project, the people go along their regular lives over time. They're moving through time and they're still experiencing project. And eventually they start to get more money. And then in addition to getting more money, they start to get a house. So things are changing over time in these people's lives, things that we care about. Things that we think our program is probably helping, like how much money they have and whether or not they have a house. So these are the outcomes that we're interested in. How much money they have and what their housing situation is. And is our project, is the training that we're offering these people having an impact on the fact that these people now over time who are in our project have money and housing that they didn't have at the start of the project? Are we having an impact? And this is where an RCT often comes in. You'll often hear someone say, you should do an RCT. That's a really good way to find out if you're having an impact. Again, RCTs are randomized control trials. RCTs can be helpful to understand how will you know whether the changes that happened are because of your project. So we saw over time that people got more money and they got better housing. But is it possible that those people got more money and better housing because the economy got better, or because they got older, or because your project's actually having an effect? How will you know how much of the changes are simply because of time or other factors, and how much of the changes are because of your project? Essentially, the ideal thing to do would be to get two versions of each person. So we have one person here who's the before person. And ideally, we would then get two versions of this person. One version is what this person's like after participating in our project. And this second person is a duplicate, and we can tell what this person's like over time, but without benefiting our project. So that would be the perfect way. So if I was going to participate in the employment education project, ideally, then you would be able to look at me at 2 points in the future. One, after I have completed the project and see how much money and housing I have. And then another version of me in an alternate reality who did not participate in the program and see how much money and housing do I have. And then the difference between these two versions of me, or these two versions of any person, would be the impact that your project had. The amount of money with the project minus the amount of money that I would have gotten anyway without the project equals the amount of money that I got because I participated in the project. So that would be an ideal way to get a sense of the impact that my project had. The problem is that there are not really good ways to get an alternate version of me or an alternate reality and figure out what the actual impact is. So instead, what we do is we get a lot of different people, and some of them take our project and some of them don't take our project. And then we look at the difference between those two people after the time has gone by and say, what can we tell about these two people and the difference to see if we had an impact. So in other words, this person dressed in orange here, we measure how much money and housing they have before our project. We give them our project, and then we measure how much money they have after our project. Oops. Then this person on top, dressed in red, we measure how much money and housing they have at the beginning of the project. We do not give them our training. And then we measure how much money and housing they have at the end. And instead of comparing this orange person and a hypothetical alternate reality orange person, we compare this orange person with this real red person to see what happened. Now that's an okay way of measuring impact and finding out whether your project had any effects. The problem is that these two people, the red person and the orange person, are not exactly the same. So when we showed here that there's two kinds of things that cause changes, your project is causing changes, and then the factors outside of your project are causing changes. Because these two people, the red person and the orange person, are different people, the factors that are influencing them over time will be different. So we can't really control for those factors perfectly because they're humans, and we can't tell them what they're allowed to do and watch and eat and think every second of every day. So instead, what we do is we get a whole bunch of people, and we randomly sort them into the red group at the top, people who won't receive our project, and the orange group on the bottom, people who will receive our project. And the idea here is that if we have enough people and we randomly assign them to either be part of the project or not be part of the project, that means that all the other factors that are going to influence the outcomes will be also randomly mixed up and distributed between the red group and the orange group. So we won't have to worry too much about all the different factors that are going to cause differences. And this will help us just see the pure impact of our project. This is called a randomized control trial. And it's called randomized because you can see right here, people are randomly sorted into groups. This is the important part. If the researchers get to select which people are in which group, it's likely that there'll be something called selection bias, where different types of people will be sorted together in clumps. Or if the people themselves get to pick whether or not they want to be in which group, they'll definitely sort themselves into groups of similar characteristics. So when we randomly assign people, what we're technically doing is avoiding something called selection bias. So what we do when we randomly sort people into the two groups, we're avoiding something that's technically called selection bias. It can be self-selection bias, so people, whether they choose whether or not they want to be part of the group, different types of people will choose different types of groups. So all those other factors that we saw here in this, all those purple other factors will influence which group people choose to be in. And therefore, we will be measuring partly the effect of our projects and partly the effect of all the other factors that these people bring with them. Same thing if the sample is done on convenience. So if one community is closer and more convenient to deliver the project to, so we select that community to deliver the project to, we will be able to measure partly the red, how our project's having an effect, and partly the purple, the factors outside of our project, because we've chosen a community. And if you randomly assign people or communities to participate in your project or not, you are effectively removing all of the purple factors outside your project, and you're just left with the red part, the impact of your project. So this is why researchers really, really, really like RCTs and recommend we use them a lot. However, RCTs are often called the gold standard. Randomized control trials, you'll often hear they're the gold standard. If you need evidence, they are the gold standard of evidence. And I have a lot of experience with this. I've run a lot of RCTs and I've run a lot of not RCTs. And I do not think that RCTs are the gold standard of evidence. I think RCTs are the gold standard of being RCTs. And this is why. Let me move this a little bit. Okay. Nope, that did not work. We'll move us down here. Okay, so in our program, we want to see if the employment training that we did increases the average income of the people that were involved in our project, because again, it was an employment training program. And if we want to know the unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect of the population, RCTs are definitely the gold standard of answering that question. So let's look at this sentence. The unbiased estimate, unbiased, does not here mean unracist or not sexist or not homophobic. It's the word unbiased here does not have kind of a social identity or common usage meaning. Unbiased here essentially is a technical mathematical term, and it has to do with the likelihood that that if you crank the statistical algorithm many times, the point estimate will stay the same. So it's a very technical term that does not mean unbiased in the common lay person use of the term unbiased, but it is an important mathematical term. Estimate, so that means our best approximation, I wouldn't say guess, but our best calculation of the average. An average is really important here. So RCTs, randomized control trials, really only work with data that you can take an average of. So if it's an outcome that's like, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? And it's chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, or pistachio, an RCT isn't really going to work for that because you can't take an average. It's okay for income. So unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect. And so that's the treatment effect is what change did our project cause of the population? So this means what's the average change that happened across the population? So for example, in our study, we found that the population average income increased by $100. This does not mean that this is telling us what happened to a typical individual. So the average treatment effect of the population is not what happened to an average person in the population or how a typical individual person in our program experienced a change. It's very possible, and happens all the time, that an RCT that finds an unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect of the population can very robustly, strongly, and significantly say, we found that the population average increased by $100. What that will not tell you is that it's entirely possible that the average income increased by $100 in the population because a small number of people in the population had their income increased by $1,000 and a big group of people had their average income decrease by $100. So it's very possible for an RCT to find correctly that the average treatment effect of our program to train people for work resulted in a population average increase of $100. But what that result does not tell us and cannot tell us, an RCT cannot actually tell us the variation that's around that unbiased average. So it cannot tell us accurately what happened on the ground, which is that a small number of people had their incomes increase by a large amount, $1,000, and a lot of people had their average income actually decrease. So to say an RCT is the gold standard of evidence, in my opinion, does not stand up. RCTs are absolutely, yes, the gold standard of answering the question, what is the unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect of the population? And this is often important if you are trying to do something like test a new vaccination or test a specific type of drug. For several reasons. You do want to know what the unbiased estimate average treatment effect is, and you also have a very specifically defined population. However, when you take these types of methods like RCTs and apply them out in the field to humans that have a lot more self-direction and agency than peas or beans that you might be fertilizing, and have a lot more complex factors in what's influencing the outcomes than the simple does this drug cure diabetes? That's a very specific answer, and curing diabetes is not likely to be influenced by too many different social locations, for example, whereas an increase in income is influenced by all kinds of social locations and larger infrastructure. So what is an RCT? An RCT is the best way to get an answer to this question: what is the unbiased estimate of the average treatment effect of the population? If you really want to know what the average change is across the population, controlling for a lot of other factors, so being able to remove a lot of other factors, then RCTs are absolutely the gold standard. If you want to know the answer to almost any other question about change, then you should not use an RCT. Randomized controlled trials cannot answer questions like, will this scale? Who does this work for? It cannot tell you why this works. It cannot tell you how long does this work. And it cannot tell you in what context it works. And it cannot tell you where this works. And it's not usually great at answering questions over time. So these are the things that you need to think about when someone is saying to you, we need to do an RCT, or did you do an RCT? Or RCTs are the gold standard of evidence. The question is, RCTs are the gold standard of what? RCTs are absolutely the gold standard of one specific type of evidence. And they are actually quite bad at generating answers to most other types of evidence.